All right, welcome back to Module 4. It's time for everybody's favorite subject, ethics. Is using AI for journalism okay? Is it cool? Is it not cool? Is using AI at all a good idea? Is it ethical? Is it true to our journalistic principles? This conversation is one that likely has no real end in sight, and it will probably continue for the foreseeable future, or at least for as long as these tools are relevant and are at the forefront of the discourse and the changes in technology and process for journalism and news gathering. So I've taken the time to attempt to distill the conversations and articles and discourse that I've encountered, that people in the circles that I run in regarding the use of these tools in professional capacities in journalism and media. And I've tried to distill those down into 7 big buckets, 7 categories or areas of focus where I think the most relevant and topical questions are being asked. And these discussions all sort of revolve around what the point is of using these tools, what is the benefit, who gets that benefit, and where do these tools come from? Is it ethical to use them at all? Is it ethical to use any technology that may have or has some demonstrably unethical process involved in its creation or dissemination, or in this case, training? And so we're going to get into all of that now, and we're going to start with a conversation about transparency and trust. This is one that every newsroom or every editor and reporter who's had these kinds of conversations has undoubtedly encountered. And the biggest one is everybody wants to talk about disclosures. We have to disclose that we're using these tools. And I completely agree that this is important, but I think it's important to also ask some questions a little bit and go a little bit deeper into what we're actually talking about here. Are there several areas of the journalism industry and the journalistic process and the news gathering procedures that can and should be opened up and made more transparent, that should bring the public, our readers, our communities into that process to reveal exactly what's going on behind the scenes? Absolutely. And the list goes on and on. Is AI one of them? 150,000%. Obviously, it makes sense if you are using a tool and there is some possibility that the use of this tool impacts or changes the output or the way that you produce the news and the way that you perform this public service. Absolutely, you should disclose this and you should be very upfront with it. Now, that being said, do we want every article that has used an AI tool, either in the back office or gathering aspects of journalism, or all the way up to the actual writing and editing? Do we want to list every single prompt we use, every tool, every back and forth conversation that we have with the tools at the bottom of every article? Probably not. So it is important to discuss with your coworkers, with your editors, with your managers, and with your colleagues what the balancing point is between disclosure and usability and user or reader experience. The same questions could also be asked about, when a photo editor or a photographer or a graphic designer uses a Photoshop filter, a content-aware fill, or any number of different tools and technologies that enhance or augment their ability to do their job and to provide and present a quality product or a quality public service. At the same time, we have to distinguish between a performative and a substantive disclosure. There are a lot of people out there and some newsrooms and some media outlets out there who seem to prefer to use the disclosure statement about their use of AI as more of an accountability sink than a pulling back of the curtain. And what I mean by this is, if you are using a disclosure at the bottom or at the top or somewhere on your article or news site that says we used AI or AI helped in some capacity for the production of this story or this piece of media, and you are using that as a shield or a curtain to blanket over your lack of editorial standards or your lack of verification and validation processes so that you feel like you just can run whatever the bot spits out and then point to that disclosure and say, well, we disclosed it, then that's not an accountability measure. That is an accountability sink. That is you offloading the responsibility for the decisions, the editorial and the publishing decisions that your organization makes to a non-entity, an algorithm that cannot by default and by definition be held accountable for those decisions. So I argue vigorously, as do many others in the field, that no tool, no entity, no algorithm should be in charge of making any decision or any judgment call that can have a material or substantive impact on real human beings' lives or livelihoods. And you see this sort of cropping up where these companies, these agencies, administrations are very eager to sort of hand over decision making to these tools in cases like criminal justice, insurance, healthcare decisions, liability decisions, anything, all of these areas where a wrong decision can not only devastate or completely ruin or derail someone's life, but then when it comes time to hopefully hold the people who made that decision accountable, it is in fact not a person. So this is a huge issue, and you should take this into consideration when you are deciding what tools to use, how to use them, and what level of human oversight that is required in that process in general. So you have to maintain trust. It's important to have disclosures, and you can write explainer articles. You can have entire pages on your website dedicated to how you use this new and emerging technology in the production of journalism and news at your organization. But the minute you start offloading the accountability and the trust and the judgment to these tools and using the mere disclosure as an accountability sink or a CYA policy, you've lost the plot and you have veered into unethical and improper use of these tools. And the same thing applies for any technology or tool. There are also a lot of concerns, rightfully so, about the use of these tools and their impact on the broader labor market, on the labor power and labor rights of individual working journalists and workers at newsrooms, whether they be in the newsroom doing the reporting and editing or on the publishing side or the advertising side. It doesn't matter. This happens, and this conversation happens every time a new tool or technology comes around that claims to increase productivity and efficiency and reduce costs. And I would argue this is more of a function of the economic system that we operate within. Capitalism is very good at finding ways to reduce the costs. And what is the most costly aspect of any business in most cases? It is the labor, it is the actual staff, the workers. And so anytime we have this conversation about balancing productivity and efficiency with the retention of human staff and costly human laborers, we're going to butt heads with capitalism. We're going to butt heads with the economic system that incentivizes profit over people. And I would argue that until we deal with that root cause and we ultimately reckon with those perverse and backwards incentivized systems, we're going to keep having this same conversation over and over again every time it comes up. And so, of course, it's important to keep yourself up to date and take classes like this and stay professionally relevant in technology and other areas of your job. And of course, it's important to pair human journalists with any advance in technology, especially one that is so often and eager, seemingly, to spit out nonsense. But this conflict cannot be resolved unless we grapple with the inherent contradictions of an economic system that throws all long-term benefit to the wind in favor of short-term gains and short-term profit. And of course, over time, I would argue and I would predict that we are actually going to see a renewed premium and a renewed value on the actual human beings that do the journalism, because we all know that that's what actually makes journalism worth it. That's what actually makes media and art and human engagement worth it. It's that human connection. And I keep saying this, I come back to it over and over again, but if you don't give enough of a shit to write it and to edit it and review it, how can you possibly expect anyone to give enough of a shit to read it, consume it, and consider it? And I think I wish that newsroom executives and the people who are actually making these decisions to cut staff and lay off people in favor of these new and emerging and changing every week technologies come to the realization, to the truth that no matter what tool or shiny object you chase, the core value, what makes your stuff, your work, your service, your content, your product, whatever, what makes that worth it is the human element of it. It's the idea, it's the choices, it's the decisions that go into every single element of what we do that really make that valuable. And until we reckon with that, we are just going to have to keep repeating this conversation forever, it seems. Now, of course, going back even further, and one of the main concerns that a lot of people have, rightfully so, is where does the training data for these tools come from? Whose work is this trained on? And we've seen and we've discovered, and it's been exposed by journalists, I might add, that ultimately most, if not almost every tool out there, LLM tool out there, was trained on intellectual property that was either stolen or scraped or taken and used without permission from the original creators, whether that be journalists, Reddit users, YouTube commenters, YouTube publishers themselves, the New York Times, apparently, and there are lawsuits abound. There are lawsuits everywhere about this. And a lot of these conversations tend to more heavily reflect the concerns surrounding AI generated images and visual components, especially since the visual and aesthetic styles of the artists and creators whose work these bots were trained on is so visually apparent in some of the outputs, and the fact that these tools let you directly request art and images and graphics in the style of real living working people. And so the conversation doesn't always lean towards the text generation aspect of this, but as I mentioned before, the lawsuits from the New York Times and other publishers and writers and authors certainly betray that that is actually a big part of the conversation as well. So it's important to ask these questions. What kind of impact are these tools having on the creative and professional output and prospects of the writers and editors and artists and authors and illustrators whose work was used to train and ultimately produce this work? Not to mention what individuals from what particular countries are the ones paid incredibly low to barely any wages to do the reinforcement and human paired learning, where they measure or they review the outputs and determine whether it is a good or a bad output. The amount of humanity and human effort and toiling that went into these seemingly magical tools cannot be overlooked, and it cannot be understated. So you have to use these tools at your own risk. And I would argue personally that a lot of the conversations around the use of this information, of the training data, would not be as fervent or strong or energetic, or at least as not as vitriolic, if these tools were indeed released in an open source public benefit capacity, similar to what Wikipedia does. The questions and conversations around the human training elements in foreign countries with crappy labor laws, those still probably would exist. Hopefully, and one can only hope, there are tools out there or organizations out there who are building and constructing and training some tools in a much more ethical way. But until then, you're just going to have to grapple with, do you want to use these tools knowing what we know about how they were created and trained? But ultimately, these kinds of impacts, both economic, professional, and bigger picture, are going to continue to unfold, and we're going to see how they play out. Now, another concern, or at least an area of concern, one that I've seen personally in my role as an adjunct professor at Montclair State University, is the impact that these kinds of tools and the availability, the immediacy of them will have on future generations of journalists and media makers and creators. I try in my class at Montclair to not sound like the teacher in the 90s who is saying, well, you're not going to have a calculator in your pocket every day when you grow up. And it's like, well, yes, actually, I do have a calculator in my pocket. It's actually more of a NASA space computer in terms of its computational capacity. That doesn't mean I'm actually good at math. I'm actually really bad at math, as I'm sure many of you are. That's probably why you're in a language or journalistic focused profession. But this goes to, I think, a deeper issue, and it goes even beyond having a calculator in your pocket. The last few generations have grown up with the ability to ask and ostensibly receive answers to any number of infinite combinations of questions and queries by just accessing Google or Wikipedia or whatever. That didn't necessarily result in an incredibly informed populace, as anybody who has looked at Pew Research studies or literacy rates in the United States and abroad. So what kind of impacts is the immediate and ubiquitous access of instant correct sounding answers and responses on future generations? And if we believe, as I do, that writing is thinking and thinking is hard, what happens when people offload their thinking, let alone their writing, but their thinking to these tools, putting aside the concerns of accuracy and misinformation and bias and incorrect responses and hallucinations? Even if they were right 100% of the time and they were perfectly accurate, what kind of impact might that have, and will that have, on future generations of students, educators, journalists, professionals, And how are we going to need to adapt and change our systems and our pedagogical structures to account for this and to mitigate some of the worst elements of this? I mean, the studies have come out, one from even Microsoft itself, that show that using these LLM tools is correlated with a direct and substantive decrease in the capacity of the muscles and the brain processes involved in critical thinking. Your skills will atrophy if you don't use them, and your intellectual skills will likewise atrophy and degrade if you offload and outsource your intellectual reasoning, your critical thinking to tools outside of your own brain. So what does that mean? And what does that mean for you? How much of these daily tasks of your work, of your intellectual profession and your intellectual pursuits are you willing to offload to these tools? And what is that going to do to your brain? I've said this before as well, and it's a little crass, but these tools make it very easy to be a piece of shit, whether it's cheating on something or taking shortcuts. It's very tempting. And you know when you're using these tools to be a piece of shit. And it's upon you and it's upon every one of us to fight that urge and to push back against that and resist the call, the siren call of these tools to take these shortcuts, especially when it comes to our cognitive processes. Can we expect adolescents and children to have that same mental and intellectual fortitude to understand the bigger picture of how this impacts them? I don't think so. So I think it's going to be on us as leaders, as professionals, as educators, and as journalists to try to push back and to create strategies, structures, and systems to mitigate some of the more devastating potential impacts of these tools. And of course, everybody's talking about the bias, the representation, the fairness, the misinformation, the leanings and persuasions of these tools and the models and the underlying training data. A lot of this and this conversation seems to sort of implicitly rely on an assumption that professionals are just taking the outputs of these tools and publishing them out without looking at them. And that seems to be a lot of where the conversation around accuracy and corrections policies and all that kind of stuff, all those issues about what do we do if we have to issue a correction from an AI generated story, they sort of hinge on the fact that you didn't check or verify or fact check or review at all the outputs before you put them out on the internet. And the good news for this area of discussion is that if you retain and rely on even your most traditional editorial standards and practices, the process of editorial review, of journalistic review and verification, you really will run into this problem a lot less than people, obviously, who just spit out and publish whatever the bot gives them. You should treat the outputs and the generations that you get from these tools like you would any text that simply appears in front of you or in front of your desk, whether it came from a staffer, a longtime staffer, a freelancer, a contractor, or a letter to the editor from a resident or a citizen. You still have to follow the same editorial procedures and verification processes. So I'm not too concerned about this because it implies that we're just sort of trusting that what these things say is valid and they're just moving on. Now, that's not to say that it's not tempting to, especially after you get some consistently good outputs, to say, oh, I've already gotten that down. Our process is solid. This usually gives me the right answer, so I'm going to be a little less vigilant when it comes to checking and verifying what this puts out. Now, that is a real concern, and it's something that you have to constantly fight against. But a lot of these conversations tend to assume that people are just not checking and not verifying. And if you're doing that, then you're in the wrong business, because the whole point of publishing journalism and public service information is that you make sure that it's accurate and then it's correct and that it's useful and valuable. And if you're not doing that, then you're not doing journalism. So I don't know what to tell you in that case. Now, I already touched on this a little bit, but the idea that these tools and the operation of these tools and technology is owned by an opaque, faceless sort of, well, not in every case. Sometimes there's faces. Sometimes we see their faces way too much. But the whole notion that these things are owned by private corporations presents a big problem. And a lot of those issues would likely go away if you were to use only open source models or locally run models. But the problem there is that in order to effectively run and maintain and operate these models at a local level, you have to have thousands of dollars in funding to pay for the GPUs or the processors that allow you to run these models, or else you're going to be running them either very slowly or they're barely going to work at all. And two, it still doesn't allow us to get a good idea to crack it open and understand exactly what's going on. So you have to understand and you have to be careful of what information you give to to these tools? I mean, especially now since they are tied up in companies like Google. Yes, I've checked the box that says don't use my conversations to, serve your training data or to train future models. But how do we know that that they're going to do that? I mean, Gmail, the email service that the majority of people, at least in the United States, use for their private and professional conversations, is owned by Google, which runs its own AI suite of tools that have integrations with your Gmail, integrations with your Google Drive. So it really ultimately, again, coming back to that economic system, that hierarchical system of control and ownership. Who owns these tools? Who owns the outputs? Who owns and what do they do with the information that you give it? And this is a standard trade-off with any privately owned or corporate owned tool or technology. I give Google Maps my exact location at any given point during the day because the benefit of being able to know when traffic is going to jam me up or how to get from A to B, or I'm going on a road trip and I need directions. I make that decision every time I use Google Maps to trade my personal identifiable information to a faceless corporation that has no obligation to respect what I'm doing. And as more consumer safety and consumer protection organizations and agencies are dismantled under this or any other administration, those concerns are increasingly going to amplify and magnify. So these are conversations you have to have with your organization, with your company, with your coworkers, with your colleagues, your friends, and your family, and with yourself. And you have to decide what you're willing to give over in exchange for any perceived value that you get back. And then finally, we always have to come back to what is the point of using these tools? Are we using them because they are the shiny new toy and they're fun and they're interesting and they're mysterious? Or are we using them because they actually help us provide additional value and public service or civic information needs? Do they help us actually do our job better? Or are they fun, neat, and is everybody talking about them? And do we feel like we're going to get left behind if we don't use them all the time? And if the answer is, well, they're just kind of neat and cool and mysterious, then maybe it's time we take a step back and take a look at whether or not these are being used to maintain and to support our community information focused priorities, and whether or not they are actually serving and improving our long-term impact on a presumably an informed citizenship and an informed society. And if they're not, then we have to reevaluate that relationship with them. And we have to, I hate to say it, go back to just doing things the way we were doing them before. It is not the end of the world to have to write your own outlines or to edit or summarize your own work. Although even just a few years into this AI onslaught or this tsunami of AI infusions, it can be hard to reconcile and imagine that we used to do things in the old way. And for those of you who haven't fully made that shift yet, I imagine it's a little easier, but give it time and all of a sudden these tools will not only continue to feel like they are inevitable and immutable, but like it was impossible to do everyday journalistic activities and tasks without them. And we have to guard against that. We have to be careful with that. So that's an overview of some of the main ethical concerns and questions and discussions that are being had in these circles and amongst people who are genuinely and authentically concerned about not just the use of these tools in the short term, but the impacts that they have and may have going down the line even further into the future. And I've put together what I believe is a pretty comprehensive list of resources and readings and conversations about these issues, and you can find that in the optional readings document for this module. And I urge you to go take a look at that because I think these are not just really important conversations, but really interesting ones. And so as you do that, I want you to really consider and look inward and take a second to really think about your relationship, not just with these tools and this technology, but with technology in the broader sense. Now that we've had that discussion, our next video is going to focus on some of the actual practical uses for these various tools, whether they be image generation or visualization generation, and the assistive and augmentative capabilities on the visual side, and how you can use these tools to enhance the written work that you do every day. So we'll see you there.